Hi, I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Peter S. Goodman, who is an economist, and also he has written a book about, well, Peter, I'll let you tell people what your book
Sure.
is about.
Sure. Well, first of all, I'm not an economist. I got to be careful there. I've been
Oh,
writing about economics for, I don't know, a
I'm
quarter century,
sorry,
but
you're
I'm
a
not a practicing
journalist.
economist. I'm a journalist. Yeah.
You're a
Uh,
journalist, yes.
my book is about how the thing we call the supply chain failed us in our darkest hour. It traces a shipping container from a factory in China across the Pacific Ocean to a massive floating traffic jam off Southern California, and then
Right.
follows every industry that touches this cargo along its way to a warehouse in Mississippi. It's really about how we entrusted so much of the modern economy to faraway factories across the ocean, especially China, how that happened, and how that's made us extremely vulnerable to running out of all sorts of critical things when we need them.
Especially during COVID when it happened, right?
Right. I mean, I think we all remember running out of things that were critical, basic medicines. In my own family, we were living in London with a newborn in April, who was born in April of 2020. We couldn't find hand sanitizer. We couldn't even find the ingredients to make hand sanitizer. And then, of course, lots of things that we needed to divert our families. If we were in the market for exercise equipment, as we were, outfitting our basements into the gyms that we could no longer go to, that got hard to find. We couldn't get PPE. We had frontline medical workers, attending to COVID patients without face masks and medical gowns until pretty late in the first wave. It was really quite alarming. Of course, toilet paper, everyone remembers that, and that all brought
Right.
home this kind of unmistakable realization that something elemental, something that we take for granted, had failed.
Mhm. So, what exactly was the inspiration for this book? I mean, was it because you couldn't get all of these supplies, or what happened?
Yeah, I mean, what happened in my case was I was finishing up my previous book, Davos Man: How the Billionaires Devoured the World, which really looks at how rising inequality is behind a lot of the right-wing populism that we've seen around the globe. It's about the rise of Trump, it's about Brexit, which I lived through in the UK, the rise of the far right in places, really unexpected, like Sweden, France, of course, Italy. And I was finishing up that book looking at how a bunch of billionaires had essentially taken advantage of our democratic systems and tilted them heavily in their own favor, leaving lots of unhappy people who became, easy pickings for opportunists who were peddling stories about, let's blame immigrants, let's blame China, for the demise
Oh
of
yeah.
middle class existence. And I started to write about shipping disruptions because I was writing Brexit stories while I was in London. I'd been there from the beginning, and somebody told me that suddenly the cost of moving a shipping container, that's this workhorse of the global economy, from Asia to Ireland was up at that point like tenfold in the space of a few months. And I dug into that. How is Brexit causing that? Well, it turns out that was part of this global phenomenon, and we had a shortage of shipping containers in China, and I thought that was really interesting. That was part of why we had so many shortages of critical things. And then I did a story that really stayed with me for months after. I looked at the significance of so-called just-in-time manufacturing. This is this very sensible idea pioneered by Toyota at the end of the Second World War to limit how much factories make, to just replenish what's already being sold, to have suppliers of parts and components only show up at assembly lines with what's needed in real time. And I did this story for the Times, where I write about how this concept had really been perverted by a bunch of business consultants who were trying to just make stock prices go up. And it had turned into this kind of crude imperative to just slash inventory. Instead of putting parts in warehouses as a hedge against trouble, just liquidate inventory, and you, corporate executive, can keep the money in the form of higher executive compensation. And the result of this was that when the pandemic happened, and there had been warnings before that we can get into if you want, but when the pandemic happened, we really had inventory cut to the bone. So, we discovered that if you're a paint manufacturer in Wilmington, Delaware, and you need, 200 chemical ingredients to make paint. Well, if one of them is in really short supply, and now a lot of them are held up on these ships that are stuck off these coastal ports, off in these floating traffic jams, well, you can't produce at all. And as a result, contractors can't get paint, and families who are renovating their kitchens can't get the paint they require. That's just one of millions of examples. So I got really obsessed with this and realized that it required book length treatment. I wanted to go back and dig into the history of mass assembly. I mean, this book lays out the history of Henry Ford and the rise of Ford. And then I wanted to understand where the container ship came from and its significance. And then I spent 6 years in China as the Asian economic correspondent for the Washington Post. I was there right after China entered the WTO, and I knew that was a landmark, but I wanted to understand how these things work together just in time, this kind of excessive embrace of just in time, these long supply chains that were enabled by the rise of container shipping, and then trade deals like the one that brought China into the World Trade Organization. And I wanted to see how that had all combined to put us in this position. And that was never going to be done with a bunch of newspaper stories. That would have to be done at book length.
Wow. So you must have had to do a lot of research for this
Yeah,
book.
sure. I mean, you write a book, it involves research. I mean, in this case, I had some of the pieces kind of in my mental notebook from, having chronicled the rise of China into this global manufacturing powerhouse. I had been to ports around the world in the course of my reporting. I spent a lot of time in factories and had thought about just-in-time manufacturing. So in some cases, it was like putting the pieces together, but there was a lot of history that I really didn't know. I didn't know much about Henry Ford, and I was really astonished to discover that Ford. We think of him as the and by the way, let me pause and say Henry Ford is a seriously problematic character who is not lionized in my book and shouldn't be lionized. He was a racist. He was an anti-Semite. He crushed organized labor, but he knew a thing or two about making things at scale. And it was interesting to learn that he was obsessed with the supply chain. He never wanted to put himself in a position where, as he put it, he could be pinched by some supplier. And he had this famous conversation that I had never read about with Thomas Alva Edison, who was his hero, as they're coming back from this business conference at Coney Island in New York, and they're riding on a rail car through Brooklyn and into Manhattan. And what they talked about most fervently was the difficulty of getting the materials they needed to bring their inventions to life. I thought that history was really relevant. I wanted to look at the rise of monopoly power. There's a lot of engineered scarcity in this economy with large companies that have managed to carve out monopoly status, protected from competition and benefiting from shortages through higher prices. So I looked at the history of railroads. I looked at the history of the deregulation of railroads and shipping and trucking. This was all new and very fertile ground for me, and really very fascinating.
So, um, what else can we expect from you in the near future?
Huh.
More on this?
Well, I'm not working on a book for the moment, which is I'm grateful for, because I wrote two books in a row, back to back, with no book leave from the Times, a newborn in the house, a pandemic, keeping two school-age children home from school, and a move from London back to New York. So I'm trying to take a little bit of a breather from. I mean, to do that, I was getting up, 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning, working on the book, getting kids off to school, or not off to school, as it were, cooking, 27 meals a day for people cooped up by the pandemic, and then doing my regular job. So it's nice to take a little bit of a breather from that intense period. But I'm a fan of writing books. I mean, it's a wonderfully rewarding way to dig deep into a subject and to come up with, I hope, compelling stories. I'm very focused on characters. Character driven work is at the center of what I've done, over the course of my career. That's now, something like 35 years long, which makes me feel old to say out loud, but there it is. But yeah, I'm shopping around for another book perpetually because it's just a wonderful thing to do.
You haven't thought of writing fiction, though. You said character driven.
Yeah, I've got a couple of fiction ideas. You know, my wife is a novelist,
Ah,
and so I knew before I met my wife that that had to be an incredibly difficult thing to do, and you're responsible for literally every thought, every word, every comma in that book. There's no like, well, that's how it happened. That's the best I could do with the material I've got. No, that's your material. So it's always been very daunting to me, but also interesting. I mean, I'm a huge fan of reading fiction, and I have enough respect for it that I don't feel like it's something I could just dive into and just do. But yeah, I got a couple of ideas kicking around.
that would be nice to see.
Hmm.
So your book is called How the World Ran Out of Everything. Um, and so what did you consider the most challenging part of putting out the book?
The most challenging thing really was finding the single container that I could trace. I thought it needed, one character, one company, ideally one shipment, which is what I settled on, to carry the reader through, as opposed to some big sweeping textbook like treatment of something that I think most of us don't think about. I mean, this book is for a general audience. This is not written for somebody who's been wondering about the supply chain forever. It turns out to be fascinating, but let's face it, most of us think about the supply chain as little as possible, and we're invited to do so. We click the buy button on some e-commerce site, and we wait sometimes just a few hours, and something shows up magically. It's sort of like flipping a light switch, and we don't think about the electrical grid when we turn the lights on. But if the lights don't go on, especially in the middle of a crisis, well, then we become interested, and that's what I think happened to all of us. But I wanted to bring the lay reader into this complex terrain. So for the longest time, reporters, especially business reporters, were constantly getting cold pitches from PR people that usually go something like, "Hey, that was a great story you wrote about X. How about you write about, another story involving my client? I could set that up." And we tend to just delete them or ignore them or whatever. I started to respond to a lot of PR pitches from people who were responding to my supply chain stories. Oh, I have another case for you involving, and I would say, well, no, that's not really what I'm looking for. But what I'm looking for is somebody or a company that would be willing to open up their whole procurement world and tell me, where are they making their goods? Who's making them? How did they ship a particular order? Do they have an order that got caught up in what I came to call the mother of all traffic jams? These floating queues, 50, 60, 70 ships waiting their turn to load or unload at the twin ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. And eventually I heard from somebody at Freightos, which is a site that I assume most people have never heard of. This is the way that smaller companies book shipping containers. So you're a smaller manufacturer, you're relying on a factory somewhere far away, typically China, to make your product. And it's time to ship those finished products to your home market, North America. And you're not big enough to have contracts with ocean carriers. I mean, Amazon, Target, they're moving thousands of containers a week. They have contracts with a bunch of shipping companies to handle that. You're not big enough for that. You just need one box every now and again. So you go on this site called Freightos, which is sort of like Expedia, and you type in, here's where we need it, and here's where it's going, and they give you quotes. And they said, well, actually, yeah, okay, we can look into that. And they introduced me to this wonderful guy, Hagen Walker, in Starkville, Mississippi. He was running a startup company that makes these light up plastic glow cubes. They light up when they're dunked in water, and it started as this novelty item that he sold to local bars in his college town of Starkville, Mississippi. He's a graduate of Mississippi State with an engineering degree. And bartenders, like to stick them in their cocktails. They could look down the bar. They could quickly tell who needed a refill because the light went out. And then somebody wrote to him and they said, well, actually, my child has autism, and bath time is an absolute nightmare because the sound of rushing water is overly stimulative and it's really a problem. Well, we dropped one of your glow cubes in the bath and our kid was transfixed. So this became the genesis for this idea to make bath toys that culminated in this deal with Sesame Street to make Elmo themed bath toys, and also Julia, another new character. And I met Hagen just as he had completed his first shipment. This is the most important shipment in the history of his young startup company for Sesame Street. And he had gone through absolute hell to get this thing made. Like worker shortages in at the factory in China, couldn't get raw materials. Then suddenly he's having to pay, 10 times as much to move his cargo across the Pacific as he was accustomed to. And even at these prices he's agreeing to, people are saying, oh, there's no space on the ship, it can't be done. And then the floating traffic jam off Southern California, and on it goes. And I quickly figured out in talking to Hagen that he was perfect because he was just this kind of open, curious, likable guy who was happy to have me fly down to Starkville, see his operation, sit by his side as we plowed through all these emails and kind of excavated this story of what had happened. And by the way, the context was new to him. I mean, he uses the shipping industry, but most of us get on planes. We don't know how the airline industry works, and so it was for him. So the history was really interesting to him, but that was the hardest thing to nail that down. And then I was able to find some people in the shipping data industry who could X-ray for me the floating traffic jam off LA Long Beach at the time that Hagen Walker's container arrives on this Maersk vessel, the Maersk Emden. And I was able to figure out, like, here are all the other things that are held up in this traffic jam as part of this phenomenon where, literally by one estimate, $1 trillion worth of product, you heard that right, trillion, is just floating off of ports around the world, stuff that's supposed to be somewhere else, but the whole system has just been swamped.
I would bet that was challenging. Ooh.
But once I nailed that, I mean, then it was just like ask some pretty obvious questions, and it was like putting your bucket out to collect the rain in terms of the stories. The story just kind of told itself.
Okay. So now I have questions about you about being a writer. I know you were a journalist. What is your favorite part about, well, we're talking about this book. What is your favorite part about writing this book on the whole writing and publishing process?
Um, it's all pretty wonderful. I mean, you get to read, in this case, I read a lot of history, exploring stuff that I realized I didn't know sufficiently in detail. I mean, any student of the American economy or the global economy is going to be fascinated by the story of how railroads were built in the United States. I mean, that was really pretty incredible. But I take pleasure in gathering up the material and then the writing itself. I mean, if you have good material, then you can write in a narrative way that's quite satisfying. I mean, in a way where I have a general interest reader in mind. And again, there's plenty in here for experts and supply chain geeks, but that's not the intended audience for this book. So I just take a lot of pleasure in the storytelling.
Okay. So what was your favorite adventure in writing this book?
Oh, that's a hard one. There were so many, but I guess the one that keeps coming back to me is I climbed into the cab of a tractor trailer in Kansas City on a day that was like minus 14 in January of 2022. And I rode along for 3 days with a truck driver down through Kansas and into Oklahoma and down to Fort Worth, Texas, and back, slept in the cab so that I could see up close who it is we're depending on to move to get our goods, to our door. I'll never see a truck the same way on the highway, and I'll never see a package at my door the same way.
Must have been fascinating.
It was fascinating, but it was also pretty alarming. I mean, that's always been a tough life. It's a life that's been downgraded by too many competitors, ironically. I mean, a lot of my book is about reckless deregulation that's laid the ground for monopolies. In this case, we've had this downgrading of working conditions and working standards. And what was incredible to me was to learn that this driver who'd been doing it for 20 years was very experienced, very good driver, liked his job, spends much of his time worrying about, how he's going to caffeinate enough that he doesn't lose momentary focus and end up in a tragedy, but not so much that he's constantly worried about pulling over and finding a place to park the truck to use a restroom. That's the kind of thing that's filling the minds of truck drivers. I remember we stopped for the night in a place in the middle of nowhere in Oklahoma, south of Oklahoma City. And he didn't like the look of the truck stop. There wasn't much to eat. There was nothing around, but he didn't want to go further down the road because his federal limit for driving would hit. And he might end up in a place where he'd either have to pay a lot for a parking spot or he might have to pull over on the side of the highway, which gave him concerns about safety. So he said, okay, here we are. And he goes into this truck stop and he comes back and he's got a turkey sandwich in shrink wrap that had been sitting there for a real long time, and then a couple of Pop-Tarts, one for dessert, one for breakfast. I mean, these are the people we're counting on to get our stuff to where it's going. And most of these people are not, paid at anything close to a middle class standard.
It's horrible, and most people don't realize how hard it is for those
I mean,
guys.
we're invited to not think about people like that. We don't, most of us don't encounter them, any more than we think about the people, in the prison that we see as we're whizzing down the highway, and there are the gates. I mean, it's like a separate realm. And that's how the supply chain is for most of us. I mean, to the extent to which we think about it at all, we may think, okay, it's not so savory. We know, people like Jeff Bezos are ending up with most of the winnings, and that doesn't seem right. That people in his warehouses don't have personal protective gear while he's, having them put personal protective gear into boxes for people who can pay for it in the middle of the pandemic, and then thanking his workers while he takes off to space, for 11 seconds. I mean, if we think about it, we know that there's injustice in it, but we all like that convenience and we've gotten addicted to it. But it all rests on this kind of normalcy that involves very commonplace, widespread forms of labor exploitation.
Mentioned something about monopolies with this new ruling about Google. It should be interesting to find out what happens with the other large companies. And
Yeah, it's game on in terms of antitrust enforcement, and that is long overdue.
yeah, so it'll be interesting to see how that affects what you were just talking about. It'll be interesting. So, what's the greatest lesson that you've learned thus far in your writing career?
You mean in terms of process?
Um, no, just in general.
Um, I mean, I come back. This doesn't apply to book writing so much, although it does sometimes. But it applies to writing newspaper stories,
Okay.
and I do think that it can apply to writing books as well if you're doing it right. Somebody told me very early in my career when I was freelancing in the Philippines. They said, if you're writing, say, a 1,200 word newspaper feature, come back, you got your notebook, you got all your stuff in your notebook. Don't flip through your notebook looking at what you've got, figuring out, how am I going to work this quote in? And this fact is interesting. Where's that going to go? That messes up your kind of organic storytelling. Rather, sit down, start telling us the story, and let your brain trigger, oh, yeah, that quote is really apt to the point that I'm making. Let me now open my notebook with intent and go find that quote. So I've obviously got the quote accurately. And now I'm going to continue on. Oh, wait, somebody gave me a statistic that actually underscores this point that's organically coming to me, in this kind of natural storytelling mode that I'm in. Now, let me open my notebook and go check that statistic. And maybe I'll have to double check it. And now we live in the time of the internet. We can go look it up. I mean, this is pre-internet. And that I think is really important because for years, I've seen especially less experienced writers just kill themselves. They're in front of some screen, they're flipping through their notebook, they're just typing stuff that they're going to have to fit together like some, patchwork quilt later. And that can tie you up in knots and you're disconnected from the way we tell stories. The way we tell stories is somebody asks us something or something has happened to us that we want to share, and then our brain knows how to do it. But if you interfere with that process by sort of swamping yourself with facts and quotes, that can be very destructive. And then, I just think the the kind of classic lessons are apt. I mean, try to write shorter, punchier sentences. Think about being sparing with your data points and your and quotes are great when that language is working in the service of your story. And if you can say it better yourself, then say it better yourself and attribute as you need to, so you're not stealing people's ideas. Yeah, those are. I guess that's my basic toolkit.
When you're writing nonfiction, it's quite different from writing a fiction book. What do you think are the hardest things to do when you're writing a nonfiction book?
I think that it is difficult to keep in mind the needs of the audience. I think if you're a good reporter, then everything's interesting, and sometimes it takes a second look to realize that, yeah, you thought that was really fascinating in the moment, but that's actually more about you and your experience because you remember something that happened to you 10 years ago and you thought this, but now it turns out to be that. But you know what? Someone coming to this material cold, none of that might be all that compelling to them. And so, what not to say, what not to ask the reader to absorb. That's the hardest thing that I puzzle over time and again. I can't remember who famously said I would have written it shorter, but I didn't have time. Was that Mark Twain? I mean, there was a guy who used to say that who I worked with at the Washington Post, Joel Garreau. Um, and I think there's a lot of truth to that. I think to write something tight and spare where you've really taken the trouble to think about how the reader is experiencing this as opposed to what it feels like to you to lay it out. I think that's just that got to be at the center of what we're doing, and it's hard to do.
Right. And what is the greatest lesson that you've learned thus far in your writing career?
Greatest lesson that I've learned in my writing career. Um, I feel like I already covered that one.
Okay.
But um, greatest lesson I ever learned in my writing career. Boy, I am stumped on that one. I mean, I told you the one about not just flipping through the notebook. Yeah, I would say it's that.
Okay. Okay. And is there any other pieces of advice that you'd like to share with other writers?
I mean, again, this stuff seems obvious to me, but you have to write. I mean, I think sometimes people get caught up in the whole like lifestyle of it all and what what lifestyle should I be living and what should my workspace look like and what kind of mug and coffee versus tea. I mean, all this kind of peripheral stuff. Should I be hanging out with other writers or not? Like, I don't know. Like everyone's going to live their life differently. Everyone will make different choices, but the one thing that's just unassailably true is you get better when you write more. The more you use those muscles, the more you discover how to solve problems. And it won't actually feel easier in many cases because you'll take on more ambitious stuff as you go. And so it always kind of feels like a strain. And I think that's right. But you will gain a sense of your own voice. You will gain a sense of how to tell a story. You just have to write. There's no excuse. I'm sorry, there's no alternative to that.
Now, I just have two more questions for you.
Sure.
One is, where can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And you can get Peter's books at
Sure.
Annie's if you call us at 508-796-5613, or you can email us at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your books?
They can find my work on my website, which is petersgoodman.com. You can find my story archives on my author page at the New York Times if you just type my name Peter S. Goodman in New York Times into whatever search engine you like, you'll end up there. And then my books are in all the usual places. I prefer that you go to Annie's Books or some other independent bookseller, but if you want to do Amazon, there it is, Barnes and Noble, Apple Books, Kindle, all that stuff. It's out there.
Okay, and you just kind of sort of answered my last question, which is how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness?
Oh, that's very kind. I'm on Twitter. I'm still calling it that, Peter S. Goodman, though it's increasingly a cesspool of algorithm hell. But I'm there. I'm on LinkedIn, also Peter S. Goodman. Instagram is mostly pictures of my kids, but if that's what you want to see, knock yourself out. Peter S. Goodman. And listen, I'm grateful to readers. I'm grateful to independent bookstores like yours. It's just incredibly important to do the work that you're doing. So I really appreciate it, Selena.
Oh, great. Well, thank you for joining me today, Peter. And if you ever get to the Boston area, hope you'll come into our store.
You bet. I would love it. Let's do it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Great
Thank
talking
you.
to you.
Great talking to you.